Imagine, for a moment, that you are handed a bill at the end of your life. Not a bill for money, but a bill for hours. Somewhere near the top of it is a line item that reads, 80,000 hours, spent at a desk, in exchange for a salary you mostly used to recover from the job that produced it. Most of us never see that bill until it is far too late to dispute it. We assume the arrangement is simply how life works. You work hard for 40 years, you save what you can, and at the end of it, if your health and your luck hold, you get your freedom back in installments, distributed to you in your 60s and 70s, when your knees hurt and your friends have scattered. In 2007, a then largely unknown entrepreneur named Tim Ferriss published a book that treated that arrangement not as a law of nature, but as a bad deal that people had simply forgotten to renegotiate. He called it the 4-Hour Workweek. Escape 9 to 5, live anywhere, and join the new rich. The title was, by design, slightly obnoxious. It was engineered to make you either roll your eyes or pick the book up, and a great many people did both. It went on to spend 4 years on the New York Times bestseller list, was translated into roughly 40 languages, and sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.1 million copies. It also became one of the most argued about business books of its generation, beloved and mocked in almost equal measure. What I want to do in this discussion is neither to sell you the dream nor to dunk on it. I want to take the book seriously as an argument, examine what it actually claims, look at where it has aged beautifully and where it has aged badly, and try to extract what remains genuinely useful almost 2 decades after it appeared. Because underneath the provocations and the infomercial packaging, there is a real question at the center of this book, and it is a question worth sitting with. What exactly are you deferring, and what makes you so confident the deferral will pay? Tim Ferriss is an American writer, entrepreneur, and educational activist, and the origin story of this book matters a great deal to understanding it, because the book is essentially a report from a personal emergency. Before he was an author, Ferriss ran a sports nutrition supplement company called Brain Quicken. By conventional measures, it was a success. He owned it, it made money, and he was, on paper, exactly the kind of young entrepreneur that business magazines like to photograph. In practice, he was working 14-hour days, drowning in the operational minutiae of his own company, and increasingly aware that he had built himself a job with worse hours than the one he had escaped. The turning point was not a strategic epiphany. It was closer to a controlled retreat. Frustrated and burnt out, he took a 3-week sabbatical to Europe, largely to get away from the thing he had built. 3 weeks became a longer stretch of travel through Europe, Asia, and South America, and during that period he was forced by circumstance to do something he would never have done voluntarily at his desk. He had to run his business without being available to it. Time zones, unreliable connections, and physical distance did what discipline had failed to do. He began checking email once a day rather than continuously. He began handing small recurring tasks to virtual assistants, including a service called Ask Sunday, paying them modest rates for work that had been eating his afternoons. He began, in short, testing whether the business actually required his constant presence, and discovering that most of what he did was not required at all. The book's structure and format then took shape somewhere else entirely, in a lecture hall. Ferriss delivered a series of talks on high-tech entrepreneurship at Princeton University, his alma mater, and those lectures became the skeleton of the manuscript. That academic origin is visible in the finished product. The book is organized like a course with assignments. It gives you exercises, deadlines, scripts to use with your boss, email templates, and homework you are told to do before continuing. It is not a meditation on work. It is a manual with a curriculum, written by someone who had recently escaped a fire and was sketching the exit route on a napkin for everyone still inside. It also arrived at an extraordinarily well-timed moment. In 2007, broadband was everywhere, laptops were cheap, outsourcing infrastructure had matured, and yet the default assumption in almost every white-collar organization was that work was a place you drove to. The financial crisis was 1 year away, which would shortly make a lot of people question the safety of the traditional career path in a much more brutal fashion. Ferriss did not predict any of that. But he published a manifesto for location-independent work right before a decade in which location-independent work became not a fringe experiment, but a recognizable category of life. Whatever else you think of the book, it was early. The philosophical core of the book, and the part one think has held up best, is its attack on what Ferriss calls the deferred life plan. The deferred plan is the default script. You accept decades of grueling work and minimal vacation, you accumulate savings, and you postpone the living part until retirement. Ferriss's objection is not that this plan is immoral. His objection is that it is a bad trade evaluated on its own terms, because it frontloads all the cost and backloads all the benefit, and it assumes a payoff that is neither guaranteed nor, when it arrives, worth what you paid. The critique has several teeth. First, it exchanges your best years, the ones with the most energy and physical capability, for your worst ones. Second, it assumes continuity, that your health, your relationships, your employer, and the economy will all cooperate for 4 decades. Third, and most interestingly, it assumes that the person who arrives at retirement will still know how to enjoy freedom. Ferriss makes a point that I think is underrated. People who spend 40 years having their days structured by an employer frequently discover, upon retiring, that they have lost the capacity to structure their own. Unlimited free time is not automatically pleasant. It is a skill, and it atrophies. Against the deferred plan, he sets a group he calls the new rich. The definition here is the hinge of the whole book. The new rich are not people who have the most money. They are people who have arranged their lives to maximize what he considers the actual currencies of wealth, which are time and mobility. Under this definition, a person earning a modest income who controls when they work, where they live, and who they answer to is meaningfully richer than an executive earning 10 times more who controls none of those things. The executive has a larger number attached to their name and a smaller life attached to their calendar. This reframing does real work. It reveals that most of us have been optimizing for the wrong variable without noticing, because income is easy to measure and freedom is not. It also produces the book's most practical early exercise, which is to stop asking what you want in the abstract and start pricing it. Ferriss pushes readers to convert vague ambitions into specific, costed targets. Not, I want to be rich, but the concrete monthly figure required to live the specific life you are describing, in the specific place you would live it. The results of that arithmetic are often startling. The dream that felt like it required a fortune frequently requires something closer to a mid-level salary, especially if it is live somewhere other than the most expensive square mile you currently occupy. Freedom, once you actually cost it out, is often cheaper than the treadmill you are running to avoid needing it. He pairs this with a hard look at fear. His argument is that most people do not stay in unsatisfying situations because they have evaluated the alternatives and found them worse. They stay because they have never evaluated the alternatives at all, and unexamined fear expands to fill the space. His countermeasure is to force the vagueness into daylight by writing down, in detail, the actual worst case of the change you are contemplating, how likely it is, how you would repair it, and what it would cost you to do nothing. Most catastrophes shrink considerably when they are made to sit still and be described. Meanwhile, the cost of inaction, which nobody ever writes down, usually turns out to be the largest number on the page. If the first move is redefining wealth, the second is a war on the inputs that consume your days. This is where the book is at its most immediately useful and also its most extreme, and both qualities come from the same source, which is that Ferriss treats time management as fundamentally a subtraction problem rather than an addition problem. The intellectual backbone here is the Pareto principle, the observation that outcomes tend to be lopsided, with a small minority of causes producing the majority of results. Ferriss's contribution is not discovering this, but applying it ruthlessly and in both directions. He asks not only which small fraction of your activities and customers produce most of your results, but also which small fraction produce most of your misery. In his own business, that second question was transformative. A handful of customers generated the overwhelming majority of complaints, service demands, and stress, while contributing almost nothing to revenue. The conventional response is to serve them better. His response was to fire them. That move alone reportedly restructured his workload more than any productivity technique. The second lever is Parkinson's law, the principle that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. If you give yourself a week for a task, it will take a week, and it will feel like a full week's worth of effort while producing what 2 focused hours could have produced. Ferriss's use of this is aggressive and, I think, correct. Shorten the deadline deliberately, and the task will contract to fit, shedding perfectionism and busywork on the way. Combine the 2 principles and you get his actual method. Identify the few tasks that matter, then impose a deadline short enough to make everything else impossible. Not a to-do list, but a to-do list with a fuse attached. Then comes the piece that most offended people at the time and now looks almost quaint, the low-information diet and its cousin, selective ignorance. Ferriss argued that most information consumption is neither actionable nor timely, that it exists to make you feel informed rather than to change any decision you will make, and that the correct response is not to consume it more efficiently, but to stop consuming it. He suggested cutting news almost entirely, batching email to once or twice a day, and adopting a policy of just-in-time learning, gathering information at the moment you need it to act rather than stockpiling it against a hypothetical future need. In 2007, this read as cranky and slightly irresponsible. In an era of algorithmic feeds and continuous notification, it reads as a warning shot fired a decade early. The mechanism he identified is exactly the one that now structures the attention economy, the sensation of productive engagement decoupled from any actual productive outcome. His practical countermeasures, particularly email batching and the use of autoresponders that set explicit expectations about response times, remain among the highest leverage changes an office worker can make and cost nothing but nerve. I want to be fair about the limits, though. Selective ignorance has a real failure mode. Applied to celebrity gossip and market chatter, it buys you back your evenings. Applied to civic life, to the conditions of the people who make the things you buy, or to the industry shifts that will eventually arrive at your own door, it is not a productivity technique. It is a way of arranging not to know things whose knowledge would be inconvenient. The book does not draw that boundary carefully, and readers have to draw it themselves. The third movement is the one that made the book famous, and also the one most likely to cause disappointment. Having freed up time and redefined the goal, Ferriss turns to the question of income, and his answer is to build what he calls a muse. A muse is a business designed from the outset not to grow into an empire, but to generate reliable cash flow with minimal ongoing involvement from you. It is not a startup in the venture sense. It has no ambition to be acquired. Its entire purpose is to fund a life while consuming as little of that life as possible. The design constraints he lays out are genuinely instructive, whatever you think of the outcome. The product should be something you can explain in a sentence. It should serve a specific, reachable audience rather than a general one, because you have to be able to find those people cheaply. It should be priced high enough that you do not need enormous volume to make it worthwhile, which also filters for customers who are less demanding per dollar. It should not require your personal presence to deliver, which rules out most consulting and most services. And crucially, the demand for it should be tested before you build it, ideally by trying to sell it before it exists and measuring whether anyone actually clicks, rather than by pouring 6 months and your savings into something nobody wanted. That last point deserves emphasis, because it was ahead of its time in the popular literature. The idea of validating demand with a cheap fake test, then building only what survives the test, is now standard practice under other names. Ferriss was preaching it to a general audience before it had a respectable vocabulary. Once the muse exists, the emphasis shifts to removing yourself from it, which means outsourcing and building rules that let other people make decisions without asking you. This is where the virtual assistant enters, the most notorious element of the entire book. Ferriss describes delegating research, scheduling, correspondence, and assorted administrative drudgery to remote assistants, frequently in countries where wages are far lower, paying them, in the plain language of the record, meagerly. He also describes empowering employees and contractors to resolve problems below a certain dollar threshold without consulting him, a small policy with an outsized effect. It converts you from a bottleneck into a person who can leave. The delegation of authority idea is sound and portable. The outsourcing arithmetic is where the book earns its harshest criticism, and I do not think the criticism can be waved away. The core proposition is geographic wage arbitrage, buying labor where it is cheap and selling output where it is expensive. Presented as a personal liberation strategy, it has an unattractive shape because your freedom is being purchased directly out of someone else's hourly rate, and the book is notably incurious about the person on the other end of that transaction. Wired's review put its finger on something adjacent when it complained that the book conveys no sense of work being anything more than a paycheck. That flatness is not only a failure of imagination about your own work. It is also what allows other people's work to appear in the book as a line item rather than as a life. There is a second honest caveat about the muse, which is survivorship. A book written by someone whose muse worked, read by a million people whose muses will not, systematically understates how much of the outcome depended on timing, on the specific arbitrage opportunities available in online advertising in the mid-2000s, and on the author's own considerable and unrepresentative appetite for risk and experimentation. The methodology is real. The success rate implied by the packaging is not. The final movement addresses the reader who does not own a business and has no intention of starting one, which is most readers. Here Ferriss makes his case for remote work, and the argument is conducted as a negotiation, not a philosophy. His approach is to treat your absence from the office as a proposition you sell to your employer through evidence rather than request through permission. The tactics are almost comically incremental, and that is the point. Engineer a day out of the office for an innocuous reason. Document that your output that day was equal or better. Extend to 2 days. Present the record. Propose a trial period with a defined end date and explicit success metrics, framed entirely in terms of your employer's interest in your productivity rather than your interest in your freedom. Make the reversal cheap and obvious so that agreeing costs your manager nothing. It is a campaign of accumulated small proofs designed to make the eventual large request feel like a formality. Reading this in the present day is a strange experience because the entire pandemic-era remote work argument was conducted along almost exactly these lines, at civilizational scale and in about 6 weeks. What Ferriss proposed as an elaborate personal negotiation strategy became, briefly, the global default, and the resulting evidence about output was messier and more interesting than either side of the 2007 debate expected. His tactical advice is now partly obsolete in the best possible way because the burden of proof has shifted. But the underlying insight that presence and productivity are different things and that most organizations have never distinguished them is one that companies are still relitigating. The other liberation idea is the mini-retirement, and I think it is the most durable contribution in the book after the redefinition of wealth. Rather than saving all your freedom for the end, you distribute it across your life in extended blocks, taking a month or 3 or 6 to live somewhere else, learn something, or do nothing, and then returning. The distinction he draws is between a vacation and a mini-retirement. A vacation is a short, expensive, frantic escape from a life you are about to return to unchanged, and its brevity is precisely what makes it so intense and so unrestful. A mini-retirement is long enough to stop being a tourist. You get bored. Boredom is the point. It is the interval in which you actually discover what you want to do with unstructured time, which is exactly the discovery the deferred life plan postpones until you are least equipped to make it. There is also a quiet piece of practical wisdom folded into this section that the book's marketing entirely obscures. Ferriss is candid that the arrival of unlimited freedom is frequently accompanied by a kind of existential vertigo. When work stops supplying your identity and your schedule, you find out how much of both it was supplying. The book's answer is not more leisure. It is service and mastery, doing things that are difficult and directed outward, on the grounds that neither consumption nor relaxation can carry the weight that meaningful work was carrying. That is a considerably more sober conclusion than the cover promises, and it is the part of the book that readers chasing beach photographs tend to skip. An honest discussion has to spend real time on the criticism, because there is a lot of it and much of it lands. The most obvious objection is the title itself. The New York Times noted early that Ferriss spends far more than 4 hours a week on blogging and self-promotion, activity he characterizes as evangelizing rather than work. That is a convenient boundary, and it exposes the trick at the heart of the premise. The 4-hour workweek is achieved partly by reclassifying the work you enjoy as something other than work. Ferriss has, in the years since, been one of the more visibly prolific people in publishing, podcasting, and investing. He did not stop working. He gained control over what he worked on, which is a genuine and valuable outcome, but it is not the outcome printed on the cover. Wired praised the remote work thinking and the pre-retirement advice, while faulting the book for formulaic writing and for taking nearly every idea to an extreme. That second charge is the fair one. The book has essentially no register between doing a thing and abolishing it. Email is either checked continuously or twice a day. Customers are either served or fired. News is either consumed or eliminated. Extremity makes for memorable prose and for advice that does not survive contact with a life that includes dependence, obligations, or a job with actual accountability. USA Today registered the natural suspicion, observing that if it all sounds too good to be true, maybe it is, or maybe not, while conceding that selective ignorance, farming out chores, and the 80-20 principle had demonstrably paid off for Ferriss himself. That is about the right posture. The techniques are real, the promise attached to them is inflated. The sharpest criticism is ideological. Writing in Jacobin, Megan Day attacked the book for advising readers to become a fake expert, which points at a genuinely uncomfortable passage in which Ferriss explains how quickly one can assemble the credentials and appearance of authority in a subject. Read charitably, it is a debunking of how flimsy credibility markers actually are. Read plainly, it is instruction in manufacturing trust you have not earned, from a book that will also teach you to sell things to the people who extend it. And the broader left critique holds that the whole framework is an individual escape hatch from a collective problem, that it takes the genuine misery of modern overwork and offers, instead of any change to the conditions producing it. A personal strategy for becoming the one who outsources rather than the one who is outsourced to. That critique does not refute a single technique in the book. It does refute the idea that the book constitutes an answer to the problem it so effectively diagnoses. Other reviewers simply found it long and hard to read, which it is, being padded with case studies, resource lists, and testimonials that were dated within a few years of publication. Leslie Garner, writing in The Telegraph, credited the punchy style and noted that Ferriss had struck a chord with his critique of workers' slavish devotion to corporations, which I think identifies the real source of the book's power. It was not the tactics. It was the permission. The cultural footprint tells the same double story. Jimmy Wales, the co-founder of Wikipedia, read it and secretly moved to Buenos Aires for a month, which is the book working exactly as intended. The Office satirized it in a 2011 episode called Lotto, in which the warehouse foreman Daryl Philbin, passed over for a promotion, applies his own interpretation of the book's ideas to do considerably less work, which is the book being misread exactly as one would predict. And in 2023, the podcast If Books Could Kill devoted an episode to taking it apart, which is the book receiving its long-delayed cross-examination. Adored, misapplied, and prosecuted. Few business books earn all three. So what survives? Let me be direct about what I think is worth carrying out of this book, and what is worth leaving behind. The redefinition of wealth survives, and it is the most valuable idea here. Measuring your life in money while your actual scarcity is time and autonomy is a category error, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Ask what your income is buying in terms of control over your own hours, and if the answer is nothing, ask what the income is for. The interrogation of the deferred life plan survives. You may decide, after examining it honestly, that a conventional career is right for you, and that is a perfectly defensible conclusion. What is not defensible is arriving there by default, having never once priced the alternative or asked what happens if the payoff does not arrive on schedule. The elimination toolkit survives almost entirely, and it is available to anyone regardless of employment status. Find the small fraction of your effort that produces most of your results, and the small fraction of your obligations that produce most of your unhappiness, and act on both. Shorten deadlines deliberately to starve tasks of the room they use to expand. Batch your communication instead of being interrupted by it. Learn things when you need them rather than hoarding information you will never use. The mini-retirement survives, and I would argue it is the single most actionable idea for the average reader. You probably cannot build a muse this year. You may well be able to arrange, over the next 2 or 3 years, one extended block of time that is longer than a vacation and different in kind. Do it while you are young enough to enjoy it and before you have forgotten how. The fear-setting exercise survives. Writing down the specific worst case, its probability, its repair cost, and the compounding cost of doing nothing is a $5 tool that regularly outperforms a year of vague anxiety. What I would leave behind is the arithmetic of the title, the implicit promise that these techniques reliably produce passive income for ordinary people, and the moral blindness of the outsourcing chapters. Take the delegation principle, which is that you should not be the bottleneck for decisions below a certain threshold. Leave the assumption that someone else's underpriced hour is simply raw material for your freedom. Almost 2 decades on, the 4-hour workweek occupies an unusual position. Many of its specific tactics have been overtaken by events, some of its resources no longer exist, and its most quotable promise was never quite true even for its author. And yet it remains in print, still argued about, still being handed to burnt-out 28-year-olds by slightly older friends who say only, read this, ignore the title. I think that persistence is explained by something the book does almost incidentally. Its lasting function was never really instructional. It was permissive. It said out loud, in a confident voice, at a moment when very few popular books were saying it, that the standard arrangement is a choice rather than a law, that it can be examined, and that examining it does not make you lazy or ungrateful or naive. For an enormous number of readers, that permission was the whole product. The templates and the outsourcing scripts were the delivery mechanism. If you read it today, read it that way. Read it as an argument to test rather than a program to follow. Be suspicious of the extremes, be more suspicious of the promises, and be genuinely skeptical about who pays for the freedom being described. But do not let the book's flaws let you off the hook for its central question, because that question does not depend on Tim Ferriss being right about anything else. What are you deferring? How confident are you in the payoff? And what would you actually do if the payoff arrived tomorrow? Most people have never answered that last one. It is worth an afternoon. It might be worth considerably more than that.